strategies for change, reasonable accommodation, and what it needs to be for disabled people with Seònaid Ó Murchadha.
My name is Seònaid. I'm a triple amputee. So when I was 18, I lost both my legs and my right hand in a fire. And hopefully you can see my right hand there, anyone who has their sight. It's a big black arm, and I've chosen it to be black and without its skin so that people can see my disability and get the hell out of my way most of the time. In particular, when I'm in my mobility scooter speeding down a pedestrianised area. But I think for me, having a black arm and talking about my disability in general is something I've always done. I was lucky enough to grow up in a world that was full of disability. So when I was growing up, having a disability wasn't that unusual. It was only when I acquired my own disability that I think I started to see all of the other societal problems that we have to face every day. Having friends and family who had a disability meant I always thought of disability as full of possibility. And it was only when I acquired my own disability that I realized that society wasn't going to have that. They were going to continue to put me into a little box, and they were going to continue to tell me what I couldn't do in a way that I didn't experience before. And I think it was that pushed me to work in the disability space. And I started working in the rehab group for a long time. Back in 2004, that would have been. So a very different kind of space. The disability kind of discrimination and all of that stuff was brand new because we only had the Employment Equality Act since 1998 and we only had the Equal Status Act since 2000. So the whole area of equality and the whole area of providing reasonable accommodation was so new that many people didn't even know how to get their head around it. I had situations in 2002 where I was looking for work and somebody actually said to me, "Oh, you have a disability, do you? So you use an adapted car. Oh, well, there's no point then in, there's no point in coming to interview then. There's no point in you being around because you have a disability, so we're not interested in you." So even though the equality legislation has been there already for 2 years, people just didn't have any kind of concept of it. When I was working in the rehab group, we got to talk at conferences to HR people and discuss what employment equality was. It was only called equality back then. It wasn't inclusion, it wasn't diversity, and we definitely didn't use the bad word disability. It was all about what employment equality is about, what the Equal Status Act is about, what the Employment Equality Act is all about, what discrimination is, and how to avoid it. And in particular, around the area of disability, what reasonable accommodation means and how can people provide it. So, disability is the only one of the 9 grounds, and I'm sure you know all the 9 grounds, we're not going to test you on that, but obviously, race, ethnicity are the same. Religion, sexual orientation, and gender has gotten so blurred over the years with trans rights and all of that, that many people would talk about it as a sexual orientation ground, but really shouldn't it be the gender ground? So they're currently looking at the Employment Equality Act to see how to be more inclusive. And there's a lot of talk about the sort of social deprivation area. And I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm really positively excited about what they can do with the disability ground. At the moment in the Employment Equality Act, the disability ground kind of covers 5 categories, which includes all the different categories of disability, but it's really medicalized. It isn't kind of a social model type approach to disability. It only really talks about an absence of bodily parts or bodily functions or a problem with your thought processes. So, typically covering physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, intellectual, mental health, and psychosocial disabilities effectively, but all from that medicalized model. So it would be exciting to see what the Employment Equality Act, if it does change its definition of disability, whether it's going to be in line with other things. I suspect that they might want to change it because the way it currently is, it includes all kind of things like migraine and things that would be very debilitating in the workplace, which couldn't get a wheelchair parking card for example. So I think it's one of those interesting areas where the very definition of disability is one that I think is going to be up for discussion because it doesn't fit in with any of the other definitions of disability that we have. And effectively, now that we have the UNCRPD, we should be looking at that, I suppose, as a definition of disability.
The UNCRPD definition of disability includes those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others.
When it comes to reasonable accommodation, there are two aspects of it. As I said, it's only the disability area that we really have to think about reasonable accommodation at all. So, what is it and what does it really look like? As we know, discrimination is where we're treated less favourably than somebody else who doesn't have that condition. So, that's what it's defined as being treated less favourably. And if you think of all the different times you've accessed goods and services or tried to get a job, I'm sure you're thinking in your head, that's pretty much every time. However, how difficult would it be to take a case every single time? And I think this is where we need to work effectively to change the law to make it better for what we need it to be. So when we look at reasonable accommodation, we have to remember as well, it's kind of stuck in the past and we need to be able to move it on in a productive and I think a proactive way that gives the people who don't know what they're talking about when it comes to disability, that it gives them some kind of guidance in particular to see it from our point of view. So I've organized reasonable accommodations for others and for myself. And I think this is where you'd be looking at reasonable accommodation from the employment perspective. When I worked in the rehab group, we always wanted to have 50% of our employees with a disability. So we always wanted to make sure that we captured them within the broader scope of disability and that we were providing reasonable accommodations as the leading disability employer at that time. And, to be honest, they probably still have those statistics. So, what it really means when we're talking about reasonable accommodation is to be helped, assisted with some sort of a change. So, an employer has to provide reasonable accommodation to enable a person with a disability to access employment, to be able to participate or advance or get promotions in employment, and also to be able to undertake training, whether essential or otherwise. So, you're looking at getting into employment, being able to progress in employment, and not being stuck at being underemployed. A change can mean either a distribution of tasks, a redistribution, maybe even, an adaptation of premises or equipment. So it might be changing the way things are done in a particular process, say, making an adjustment maybe to your equipment that you're given, maybe your laptop, headset, whatever it might be, keyboard, whatever that might look like, even to the extent of actually providing special computers or specialized equipment. So that responsibility is quite heavy. It might also mean, kind of changing the patterns of working time, whether starting later or starting earlier, or being able to kind of make a change to when you can finish, say, maybe based on seasonal changes. So something that is going to be changed about your workplace or even your interview, for example, if you're looking at access to the workplace. We mentioned training already. So to make sure that the change, the reasonable accommodation enables you to access that training or make sure that you can integrate that into whatever equipment or I suppose specialized type of assistive technology you might be using. You might even facilitate home working or remote working as it used to be known, but that one was always a very contentious issue before the pandemic. But the minute that non-disabled people needed to work from home, poof, it was done straight away. But I know for many years I would have advocated for myself to try and get working from home, and you had to jump through a load of hoops. So it's great to acknowledge that nowadays remote working is becoming the norm. The thing is, though, when it comes to disability, even the government currently aren't thinking about us when it comes to their remote working policy. But sure, that's another mountain we can climb. I think the important thing is to look at the reasonable accommodation that's there and how we can change it for the positive. So it talks about changing things, providing assistive technology, making sure that somebody can amend a task or a duty of a job to make sure that it fits for them, and that the employer is looking at the core responsibilities of the work. So when you're looking at, as an employer, whether reasonable accommodation is possible to provide, you don't have to worry about something that a person would normally get for themselves. So I don't have to ask my employer to get my bionic arm for me, for example. I have to beg the HSE and go through a process of 10 years to get it. Only 10 years is all it took. Delighted with myself when I did get it. But if you have something like glasses that you would buy for yourself and that you would use normally yourself, wheelchairs, things like that, that would be something you have to provide for yourself. But other things, adaptation of equipment that the employer provides, should be done by the employer, unless, and this is their get out clause, unless it places a disproportionate burden on them. So, what does that look like? It's too expensive. The financial or other costs entailed are just too much, or the scale of it is too much. So, for example, if you wanted to work in one of those listed buildings in Kildare Street, for example, as I did, you either have to get a very good ramp and a good set of employees with good, strong muscles on them, or you wouldn't be able to change the entire front of the building for various different reasons. It would cost too much, and it wouldn't be facilitated under the grants. They couldn't get enough money to support the scale of the change. So effectively, something that's too expensive, that the scale or financial resources are just too much for the employer's business, but also if there's a possibility of getting public assistance or public funding, that should also be taken into account. So if it's too expensive for you and the government grants don't fit in to that particular adaptation that needs to be done, then an employer can say it is not possible. It places a disproportionate burden on us. But that's only accessing employment, getting promotional opportunities, and being able to undertake training once you have those jobs. And of course, the grants that are there are very much focused only on somebody who has a job. So you have to have a contract of employment. You have to make sure you can prove that you work there. And similarly, you then have to get stamps and all the rest from your employer to be able to access those grants. So they're not as effective and they're not as open as you might think. When it comes then to accessing a service, trying to get onto a flight in the same way as somebody who paid the same amount as I did was just nigh on impossible. I had to go over and sit in a separate area, wait until somebody came for me, and be treated in a different way. It was less favourable, that's for sure. But when it comes to flight travel, it's slightly different because, people blowing each other up in the sky kind of changes things for the security. So they get away with an awful lot in the grounds of security, but I would see it as definite discrimination. I kept calling it that, and people kept saying, no, 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 security. Yeah, whatever. But discrimination on the disability ground is where you're treated less favourably than somebody else. Basically, compared to someone else who doesn't have that disability, or compared to someone else who has a different disability. But also, you have to remember in the Equality Act, it also talks about being imputed with a disability and disability by association. So my husband gets discriminated against on a regular basis because of my disability, and that would be discrimination in association.
Some comments.
There, if you want a grant, you have to have a job. If you want, if you want a job, you have to have experience, and that catch-22 situation that we all experience. Um, it baffles the mind. Overqualified, underpaid, and underemployed. That's true of so many of us. And this is where we have to break the cycle because, yes, it might be about getting in the ground level, but are you getting the same opportunities to progress? And I think that is sometimes one of the biggest challenges as well. It's being stuck in the same job for years because they don't know how to promote you.
What is underemployment?
Basically, somebody who is working in a job, even though they could probably do their boss's job. So essentially, you're talking about people who are very qualified, who are very capable, but they don't get the same opportunities to use all their skills. Adam Harris from As I Am talks about it a lot when it comes to autism. You know, because somebody is going in and doing their repetitive job, they're really good at it, they don't get the opportunities for promotion. They don't get the opportunities to move up the ladder because they don't have the social skills maybe, or they don't conform in the same way to interaction within the team. They don't go for lunch with other people. I don't like going for lunch with other people, and I'm not on the spectrum, but sometimes people find that gross. But if you're not going to lunch with people, then you're not hearing the gossip. You're not being involved in the social dynamics. So you're missing out in that particular area. So it might just mean that you're not approached by managers for positions. You're left doing the same work for a long time at the same money. Sometimes as disabled people, we're just so goddamn grateful for a job that we're not going to challenge the status quo, and we're not going to ask for more money, and we're going to happily keep doing what we're doing. And I also think, like in my own experience, difficulties around my disability has caused mental health problems that then contribute to me feeling like I'm worthless. So in a job, say for example, I am getting the wage subsidy scheme, then I don't always feel like I'm as good as my peers. The wage subsidy scheme basically means that the employer gets a subsidy for your lack of productivity. So obviously the employer is going to want to get the most amount of money. So you're going to sign up to say, yeah, okay, I have 75% less productivity than my peers. So therefore my employer needs a grant. It used to be the case that we had to actually sign a form every month for that particular grant. And every month it just chipped away at my confidence to such an extent that by the end of it, I didn't feel I was good enough to have the basic job. So I think for those of us with intersectional disabilities, with lots of different things going on, mental health, physical disabilities, other aspects, I think it definitely has an impact on us. And I think sometimes that might be why we're unemployed or underemployed, because we don't believe that we can do the job. So, how on earth are we going to convince other people to?
Reasonable accommodation and accessing goods and services.
Disability, again, under the Equal Status Act, is defined in really broad terms. Those five categories of disability, very medicalised, and really looks to kind of broaden the whole disability area to include things like epilepsy, migraine, mental health, ADHD, all those kind of psychosocial disabilities, as I would call them, but really it's neurodiversity, um, I think is a better way to describe it. When you're looking at it under the Equal Status Act, people are looking to access goods and services in the same way as everyone else, um, if they're offered in general to the public. Um, whether whether those services are sold to you, hired out to you, rented or exchanged to you, you should still have the same ability to access those services. So if you're looking at a person who sells a product or service, a person who's letting accommodation or providing accommodation, education, so third level institutions, further education institutions, and any clubs, if they don't provide special treatment or facilities to enable us to use these, that would be essentially discrimination. So they need to provide those facilities, those special, they call them, special always, special treatment or facilities to enable us to use them. So what does that really mean in practice? You're really talking about disabled bathrooms, disabled changing facilities. For example, in a health centre, shopping centre, you need to have disabled facilities, all those things. And of course, the get out of jail free card that the service providers have. is the nominal cost idea. So the nominal cost will depend on the circumstances and the size and resources of the body involved.
Are we special?
I hate that word. I think, and they're trying to change it to additional needs. It's every part of that language is it was what someone talked about when it talked about the majority rule. It's only special if you are outside of the majority. And I don't think it's extra or additional either. Do you know what I mean? It's just different. And I think that that's what I really dislike about the type of language within it. So referring to it as special, referring to it as reasonable accommodation or adjustment implies that it's okay to have a medicalized view and model when you're looking at the design of goods and services or the provision of employment. So I think even the use of that term special or additional needs, just like in the Special Educational Needs Act, it changes it into something extra that we want, making us the needy people. Having an impairment is as normal as you like.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think this is where using terms as normal, abnormal, even the language that we use to describe our own disabilities, like it is powerful. But I also think that, like, I lecture in Maynooth University on disability studies. And one of the things that I think we end up exploring is that absolutely everything in the world, regardless of which country you're coming from, is all shaped with the majority in mind. A friend of mine, Francesca Martinez, she wrote a book called What the Fuck is Normal? It's brilliant. As a woman with lived experience of disability, and she is a playwright and successful author, been on television, got involved in politics until she realized that it's a total waste of time over there in the UK. At the moment, I just think it's as normal for us as it is abnormal for somebody else. And I think that's always been the power in the way I look at things. Having a disability for me, wasn't as weird as other people kept trying to convince me of, because I knew so many great disabled people throughout my life. But the thing is, if you're told that from day one, you're going to believe it, whether you're born with your disability or you acquire it. If you're told that you're special, that you're extra, that you have to wait because this special door for you isn't open, or you just have to not go to the bathroom this time because we don't know where the key is for that disabled toilet. Like, you know what I mean? It's just not okay. And I think the way that these things are written are inherently sexist, white, male, pale and stale. You know what I mean? It is designed with men in mind of a certain age. And we do have to challenge it because it's written from an able-bodied perspective that hasn't got a clue about disability. And I think this is where, yes, we're going to be changing the legislation, but it's still going to be written by a certain cohort of people. And they're not going to have a disability. And they're not going to understand. So even the concept of reasonable accommodation is providing special treatment or adjustments to enable us to access the workplace, as opposed to let's actually shake up the world to make sure that we don't need these things. When the world is accessible, if public transport were accessible, for example, we wouldn't need all these extra things. So I think that has to be kind of taken into account. But when we're looking at changing equality legislation, they're less keen to tear up the rule book and to tear up what they've done before. It's more about kind of leaving what's there and putting stickies on it. And that's why, if they are going to be looking at changing a definition of disability, it has to be within parameters that we can advocate for and get behind. That's why I always think of the UN Convention on the rights, because it's looking at the rights instead of our needs. So I think hopefully the equality legislation and the way that they look at disability is going to align much more with our rights-based approach. But there's no guarantee of it. And I think we have to shout hard and loud and keep arguing for that way of looking at the world. But when it even comes to reasonable accommodation, so I'm as you can see, I have to look up my notes an awful lot more when we're talking about reasonable accommodation for goods and services, because it happens to me so often. I sometimes don't even register it. A friend of mine won a competition for a makeup tutorial. And I'm not really a girly girl, neither is she. And we just said, look, we'll go along for the crack, the two of us. Even though we're not girly girls, they can't kick us both out. That's what we decided. We might get a couple of tips. Now we're both disabled women, but for me, my mobility issues are kind of greater. And at that time, I had rashes all over my lower limbs. So I really needed to use my wheelchair. So I happened to say to them, look, we need reasonable accommodation. We need like an accessible training room. Have you got that? Is it okay? Like if I have to, I can walk up the steps. Dead silence. All of a sudden, the makeup class was cancelled due to reasons outside of their control. And the next time it came back on, they wouldn't accept people who had the voucher for the original workshop. So, I mean, to me, right there, that's discrimination. But how am I going to prove it? How am I going to prove that they refused and failed to provide me with the reasonable accommodation that I needed? They probably were just going to host it in an upstairs room, but they didn't get in touch with me. They didn't talk to me about how to accommodate my needs and whether we could move it somewhere else where I could access it, or even to a different date. I was willing to be open to it. I didn't even really want to go in the first place. And that was the annoying thing. I didn't even want to go. And still, I was so angry about the fact that they wouldn't let me go. So these things happen to us so often. I think we end up picking our battles and we end up picking those areas where we feel we can make a change and those areas where we think that we can actually get success. Because I was definitely discriminated against in that instance. But there might have been something that I didn't know. There might have been, somebody sick and they couldn't do it. But it was just so suspicious the way it happened. A similar situation often happens when I travel. One of my favorite ones was when we were going to Rome. It was a trip I had organized for my husband for his 30th birthday many, many, many moons ago. And I was really excited to go there. So I emailed a couple of hotels trying to see how accessible they were. And obviously, it's Rome, Roman times. It's not going to be as accessible as I would like it to. So I sent an email to a couple of hotels. Most of them didn't respond at all. One or two did respond and just said, no, we don't want your kind. You're too awkward. Then I got a really interesting long email, all in Italian. And I sent it to my friend to translate. Basically, the email said, oh my God, what the hell are we going to do? Are we going to tell this woman the truth that there's 2 steps to the lift? I responded back to them in English, telling them that I could manage the 2 steps to the lift and it would be fine if they wanted my business. I would appreciate their honesty. So they realized what they had done. So in that instance, the communication channels were opened up and I was able to go and stay there. During my stay there, the lift broke down, so they accommodated us in a variety of different rooms and different levels of the hotel, and it was a lot of fun. But they were lovely, and it was a beautiful experience. But I talked to them, they talked to me, and that was the best way to actually come to an agreement. And I think that's really what's lacking from the reasonable accommodation area. There isn't a space where people can discuss it. In in talking about employment equality and reasonable accommodation, especially, we have to mention one of the, I suppose, areas of progress and also something that I think has dragged us way back. And it's one of the big issues that they talk about when they talk about reasonable accommodation. There was a case taken in, it would have started out, I think, in 2010. So it's often referred to as the Nano Nagel case. And it's centered around a woman called Marie Daly, who was a special needs assistant in a school of disabled children. She had a significant accident in 2010 in which she was paralyzed and then had to use a wheelchair. So there were a lot of her duties as an SNA in a school for children with significant disabilities, such as lifting and assisting, that she wasn't going to be able to do as a result of her acquiring her disability. So she took a case to the school board to try and get her job back, essentially, because they had said, look, you can't do the job that you used to do. They said, but with reason, she said, but with reasonable accommodation, I can. So went to the courts. under the Employment Equality Act, Section 16, as it's known as, which talks about the appropriate measures to accommodate a person with a disability to return to work. She was successful in her case, and then it went to the appeal court. And there, the employer was successful. And then it went to the next level, and Marie Daly won her case again. And it opened up this whole discussion about what is reasonable accommodation and what does it really look like for an employer and for an employee. So Marie Daly's argument was, if you redistribute the tasks, and not all of the tasks that are involved in my job are essential, I only need to do the essential tasks and I must be accommodated for those. Where's the discussion here, lads? And that particular case is the one that starts changing things when we look at reasonable accommodation. In the brief space of time, maybe it was a couple of months, a year or so, where the employer won that part of the case in the appeal, I saw significant change in what HR managers were deciding in relation to accommodations. So we can't fool ourselves into thinking that cases don't change things, because they really do. But in all of that time, and it went on from 2010, when she first took the case, all the way up to, I think it was 2018, when it was essentially the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission got involved and started discussing what exactly reasonable accommodation means, and they reversed the previous decision. When the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission got involved, and they acted as what's known as an amicus curiae, which is essentially a friend of the court, they then went to as far as the Supreme Court, and they decided three things. It reversed the decision, so it means that reasonable accommodation can involve a redistribution of any task or duty, as long as it isn't disproportionate and changes the job completely. So it was saying that they were wrong in saying it would change the job too much. It was possible to do the job with accommodations. The Supreme Court in particular looked at an individual's employment in relation to everything else in the workplace. So it might be impossible to redistribute the tasks if she worked on her own, but she didn't. She was never working on her own. There was always two people working with a child at that particular time. It also set out an expectation that employees should expect consultation. So even though there've been plenty of cases before that looked at it as a proactive duty, something that employers really need to do so that things go smoother for everyone involved, this actually set out an expectation that we can expect that it's now mandatory for a wise employer to discuss with their disabled employee what that means and what reasonable accommodation looks like. So to engage in a dialogue in relation to the role and what changes need to happen. And I think calling it a dialogue means that it's not just one conversation and one form filled in. It should be reviewed, looked at to see if it works, looked at to see, does it fulfill your need? And one of the most important things was that it focused the dignity of the person and the state obligations in relation to the UNCRPD, and it planted them firmly within the employment space. So it's not just about our needs, it's also about our dignity and our ability to work to the best of our ability with the right supports. Now, having said all that, that would be lovely if that was true. But I'm sure we've all been in situations where our needs are found to be extreme. Looking for some software is like, oh, Jesus, we can't afford that. You know, before the pandemic, working at home was, sure, we don't know if you're going to be working at all, Seònaid. You could be asleep the whole time. You know, nobody was taking advantage of the things that we have around us as reasonable accommodation that we use every day. So, you know, when myself and James Cawley, policy officer, when we first went to the first ever kind of Zoom meeting that one of the government agencies had in relation to employment at the Comprehensive Employment Strategy Implementation Group meeting, we knew how to use Zoom. Nobody else did. We were putting our hands up the whole time, and everyone was ignoring us because they didn't know what it was. Compute or the cameras turned the wrong way around. It was just hilarious. So we were delighted to welcome them to a whole new way of interacting online that they hadn't even known about. So when it comes to reasonable accommodation, that idea that there's a dialogue, it also acknowledges, and of course, referring to our dignity and our rights within the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People or Persons with Disability. I think one of the most important things that we need to talk about when we're looking at that and we're looking at that expectation is that there is a discussion and a process that we're going to go through that's going to respect our rights. And that process will be done with us as the experts on our disability and with us as the experts on what works for us. Because if non-disabled people don't know what works for us, then how can they come up with what reasonable accommodation works for us? How are they going to know if they don't know our challenges? So at that time, after that particular case, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission had a conference back in April 2018. The first time the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission had kind of lifted the lid on what achieving a right to reasonable accommodation looks like. And they focused in particular on in the employment space. And they had so many different disabled speakers. And I love when I'm on a panel and I'm not the only disabled person in the room. Having said that, of course, some of the experts on disability who are not disabled themselves kind of made a point of one of the other speakers, their reasonable accommodation, kind of pointed it out, and it was very embarrassing for everyone involved. So even at the reasonable accommodation conference, which was full of ILMI members, by the way, and I was there representing ILMI, like the main presenter was kind of talking to Adam Harris about why he had no shoes on. Like, it was really embarrassing. So of course I blew them all out of the water going, well, I can't take off my shoes. Maybe I'll take off my legs. And that shut them up on his no shoes. But it was just so strange that even at a conference all about reasonable accommodation, that one of the things that one of the disabled presenters was doing to make themselves more comfortable, to make him better able to speak in front of a group of people that he didn't know, a large group of experts in particular, he took off his shoes. And yet it was pointed out, oh, look at him, he's taken off his shoes. That's so weird. What was so frustrating to me was they didn't even recognize that that was reasonable accommodation right there in action, you know? And that, I think, is again what we're talking about. When we're looking at the Nano Nagle case in Marie Daly, nobody ever sat down and said, right, it's been 8 years. I'm sure she's better in that wheelchair than she was in the beginning. Like, nobody ever took into account the ebb and flow of disability, how when you acquire a disability, you get better at managing it and you get better at knowing what you need. So they're the kind of things that really bug me. And having this conversation with employment lawyers, I often speak at the Legal Island Employment Equality, an annual employment law review event, and we talk about employment equality. And they're like blown away by the idea that disability does change over time. And there's no way for the law to take that into account. And the solicitors never mentioned it because maybe they weren't talking to Marie Daly, but they just didn't take into account that disability and reasonable accommodations, it isn't static. It's only as good as the day it's made. And I think this is what's really important about a reasonable accommodation process.
What we think reasonable accommodation should look like for disabled people. Our feedback. The provision of reasonable accommodation must be well resourced and robust. It is not a one-size-fits-all approach. Every individual is unique with a unique set of needs. Collective lived experience is paramount and must play a key role in developing, monitoring, and overseeing reasonable accommodation supports. We are concerned about who decides what is reasonable and what is not reasonable. Disabled people need to determine this in partnerships with the powers that be. This is where rights come in. We have a right to paid employment. This means having access to the accommodations that supports our success. We need to be consulted in relation to what enables us. The legal obligation in the provision of reasonable accommodation must be robust. Employers and those providing goods and services must be aware of the needs of disabled people. They must undergo disability quality training provided by disabled people's organizations. They need to be well informed. Our rights to study, be employed, and having access to goods and services are imperative to us living like everybody else. Access to the built environment also plays a key role. Regulations need to be fit for purpose. Our assistive technologies, aids, and devices must travel with us when leaving school, leaving college, or leaving a job. It is well researched that attitudes of employers is a huge issue for disabled people. This must change. Having access to personal assistance services should be a right when and if required. Disabled people have a right to the same life chances as everybody else. Lifetime adaptable homes are universally designed homes, and environments need to be high on the government's agenda. We are all temporary non-disabled. The fact is that most disabled people acquire their impairments. Architects and building designers do not see what we see. They do not have the lived experience. We know that if things are well designed in the initial phase rather than retrofitting, it's a win-win for everybody. Grant application forms and employment application forms can be a nightmare for some disabled people. They all need to be accessible. We know that it's very, very difficult to find work. The process can be all online. It involves screening, online questionnaires, and it's really, really hard to get a face-to-face interview, and especially in public sector jobs.